On a crisp autumn morning in the quiet village of Chipping Cleghorn, the residents woke to find a most peculiar announcement in the local newspaper. Tucked between the usual advertisements for lost pets and social events, it read, "A murder is announced and will take place on Friday, October 29th, at Little Paddocks at 6:30 p.m. Friends. Please accept this, the only intimation." At first glance, the notice seemed like some kind of practical joke, perhaps an invitation to a theme party. But in Chipping Cleghorn, where life was routine and uneventful, such a bizarre announcement could not go unnoticed. The village buzzed with gossip. Who had placed the ad? What could it mean? Was it a morbid prank, or something far more sinister? At the heart of the village was Little Paddocks, the home of Miss Letitia Blacklock. A reserved but respected woman, Letitia lived with her companion Dora Bunner, affectionately known as Bunny, and two young lodgers, Patrick and Julia Simmons. Letitia was as surprised as anyone to see her home mentioned in the paper. She insisted she knew nothing about the announcement, but her reaction betrayed a flicker of unease. That evening, the villagers gathered at Little Paddocks, driven by a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Miss Marple, staying nearby with her friend Mrs. Harmon, was among them. She had heard about the strange announcement and couldn't resist attending. After all, Miss Marple knew human nature better than most, and her instincts told her this was no ordinary joke. At precisely 6:30 p.m., the lights in Little Paddocks went out. A single gunshot pierced the darkness. Screams followed. Someone lit a candle. A figure lay sprawled on the floor of the drawing room. The body belonged to a stranger, a man none of the guests recognized. He had been shot through the head. Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the room as the shocked guests stood frozen. The locked doors, the broken vase, the lingering scent of gunpowder. A murder had indeed been announced. And now, it was Miss Marple's task to uncover the truth. The villagers stood in stunned silence as the body on the floor was slowly identified by the police. The dead man had no identification, no wallet, only a revolver lying nearby. Chief Inspector Craddock arrived promptly, his sharp gaze scanning the room as he took charge of the scene. Letitia Blacklock, her face pale and drawn, insisted she had no idea who the man was or why he had come to her home. Bunny was trembling, clutching Letitia's arm. Patrick and Julia looked unnerved but composed. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the back of the room, observed everything with sharp eyes. She noticed the position of the body, the angle at which the gun lay, the shattered vase on the floor. Subtle clues, tiny details. Chief Inspector Craddock turned to Letitia. "You said you didn't place the announcement?" "No," Letitia replied. "It's absurd. I would never joke about something like this." Craddock's brow furrowed. "And you've never seen this man before?" "Never." Miss Marple stepped forward. "It's curious, isn't it?" she said in her gentle voice, "that he would know the precise time and place." Craddock gave her a wary look. "Do you have any ideas, Miss Marple?" "Not yet," she replied softly. "But I suspect it's not as random as it appears." The police removed the body, and the guests were asked to remain for questioning. Miss Marple's mind was already working. Who stood to benefit from this? Why would someone orchestrate such an elaborate scene? And most importantly, why announce the murder beforehand? She watched Letitia closely. The way her hands trembled, the nervous glances exchanged between Patrick and Julia, the curious fear in Bunny's eyes. Somewhere in this room lay the answer. Miss Marple intended to find it. The morning after the murder, Chipping Cleghorn was abuzz with speculation. Who was the dead man? Why had he come to Little Paddocks? And why had someone announced the crime in the paper? Miss Marple paid a visit to Little Paddocks, where Letitia Blacklock sat in the parlor, looking drawn and exhausted. Bunny sat beside her, clutching a knitting project that lay untouched in her lap. "May I sit down?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Of course," Letitia replied. Miss Marple's sharp gaze swept the room. The broken vase had been tidied away, but the atmosphere of unease lingered. "It's all so strange," Letitia said. "I don't know who that man was or why he was here." "Perhaps he knew you," Miss Marple suggested softly. Letitia's hand tightened around her teacup. "I don't think so." Bunny suddenly spoke, her voice tremulous. But he seemed to know you, Letty. He looked at you before the lights went out. Letitia's eyes darkened. That's impossible. Miss Marple leaned forward. You didn't recognize him at all? Letitia hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking her head. No, I swear. But Miss Marple's intuition told her otherwise. Letitia knew more than she was admitting. Patrick and Julia entered the room. Patrick's easy smile faltered when he saw Miss Marple. It's dreadful, isn't it? He said casually. All this fuss over some stranger. A curious reaction, Miss Marple remarked. After all, someone was murdered in this house. Patrick's smile tightened. Yes, well, none of us knew him. Julia shot him a warning glance. Miss Marple caught it. Secrets, hidden motives, lies beneath the surface. Miss Marple smiled sweetly. Yes, but murder is rarely random. I'm sure the truth will come out in time. Letitia's hand trembled as she set down her teacup. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The truth was already beginning to take shape. Later that day, Chief Inspector Craddock arrived at Little Paddocks with news. He gathered Letitia, Bunny, Patrick, and Julia in the drawing room. Miss Marple stood discreetly to the side, listening carefully. We've identified the dead man, Craddock announced. His name was Rudy Schurz. He was a Swiss national, working as a receptionist at a hotel in Medmenham Wells. Letitia's brow furrowed. I don't know anyone by that name. He had a criminal record, Craddock continued. Small thefts, forgery, nothing violent. But there's more. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened as Craddock pulled a small notebook from his pocket. We found this on him. It contains your name, Miss Blacklock. Letitia's hand flew to her mouth. My name. Craddock nodded grimly. Your name and your address. A heavy silence filled the room. Miss Marple watched Letitia's reaction carefully. The widened eyes, the trembling hand. It's no coincidence, is it? Miss Marple murmured. Someone wanted Rudy Schurz here. Someone wanted this performance. But why? Julia asked, her voice sharp. To frighten me? Letitia suggested. Or perhaps to kill me? Craddock's gaze darkened. Or perhaps to make it look that way. Patrick spoke up. So, this wasn't a robbery? Craddock shook his head. There was no sign of forced entry. No valuables missing. He wasn't here to steal. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. Or perhaps he was promised something in return, she said quietly. Craddock looked at her with curiosity. You think he was part of setup? Perhaps, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. Or perhaps he was a pawn in someone else's game. Letitia stood, her hands clenched at her sides. If someone wanted to kill me, why make it so public? Why announce it in the paper? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Because the true target might not have been you. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Harmon in the cozy sitting room of the vicarage. A crackling fire warmed the room, but Miss Marple's thoughts were focused elsewhere. It's a curious thing, isn't it? Miss Marple said, knitting needles clicking softly in her hands. What is? Mrs. Harmon asked. The announcement in the paper, Miss Marple replied. It would have taken planning and precision. Someone had to place that ad days in advance. They had to know Letitia Blacklock's schedule, the layout of Little Paddocks, and the exact timing of the lights going out. Mrs. Harmon frowned. But why make it so public if the intent was to kill her? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Because perhaps the true goal wasn't murder at all. Mrs. Harmon's eyes widened. But someone died. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. But why kill a stranger, a man with a record of petty crime? Unless he was meant to die? A scapegoat? Miss Marple nodded. Precisely. But why would someone want to frame Letitia? Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. Perhaps Letitia wasn't the target at all. Mrs. Harmon's brow furrowed. But who else could it be? Miss Marple's gaze turned toward the fire. There's something not quite right about Letitia's past, she said softly, and I intend to find out what it is. The doorbell rang. Mrs. Harmon stood. Who could that be at this hour? A uniformed officer stood at the door, his face grave. Chief Inspector Craddock requests Miss Marple's presence at Little Paddocks, he said. There's been another incident. Miss Marple rose, her expression sharp. Well, she said briskly, it seems the mystery is deepening. Miss Marple arrived at Little Paddocks to find the atmosphere heavy with dread. Chief Inspector Craddock stood near the foot of the staircase, his face grim. Letitia Blacklock, pale and shaken, sat in a high-backed chair. What happened? Miss Marple asked quietly. Craddock's jaw tightened. Bunny. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Is she hurt? Dead, Craddock replied darkly. Poisoned. Miss Marple's hand touched her throat. Poisoned. Craddock nodded. She took tea in her room shortly after dinner. She mentioned having a headache and retired early. A servant found her unconscious an hour later. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. And the tea, laced with belladonna, Craddock said. Someone wanted her dead. Letitia's voice was faint. But why, Bunny? Miss Marple's expression darkened. Perhaps Bunny knew too much. Patrick and Julia stood nearby, exchanging tense glances. Julia's hand rested on Patrick's arm, as though steadying herself. Miss Blacklock, Craddock said, did Bunny say anything unusual before retiring? Letitia shook her head slowly. No, but earlier she did mention that she remembered something about the man who was killed, something she had forgotten before. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. What was it? She didn't have time to tell me, Letitia replied, her voice tight with grief. She said it was important, but then she seemed to forget it again. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She didn't forget. She was silenced before she could speak. Craddock's jaw clenched, which means that someone in this house knew what she was about to reveal. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Patrick and Julia. Patrick's smile was thin and brittle. Julia's eyes avoided direct contact. It's all connected, Miss Marple said softly. The announcement in the paper, Rudy Schertz's death, Bunny's murder. Craddock turned to Letitia. Miss Blacklock, are you quite sure you don't know why someone would want you dead? Letitia's hand trembled against the arm of the chair. I've told you everything I know. But Miss Marple saw it. Just the slightest flicker of hesitation in Letitia's eyes. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not quite everything, I think. The following morning, Miss Marple sat with Chief Inspector Craddock in the study at Little Paddocks. The house was cloaked in an uneasy silence. Bunny's death had cast a long shadow over the household. Craddock rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Bunny was poisoned with belladonna. That's not an easy substance to come by. Someone in this house had access to it. Miss Marple nodded. Or someone who knows a great deal about plants. Craddock's eyes darkened. You have someone in mind? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not yet, but I believe the key lies in Letitia Blacklock's past. You think this is personal? Very much so, Miss Marple replied. And I suspect that the past has finally caught up with Miss Blacklock. Craddock stood and paced the room. Letitia insists she doesn't know why someone would want her dead. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. And yet Bunny knew something. Something important enough to warrant her death. A knock sounded at the door. Patrick entered, looking nervous. Inspector, you wanted to see me? Craddock gestured for him to sit. Where were you last night around the time Bunny took her tea? Patrick's expression hardened. In the garden. Julia was with me. Can anyone else confirm that? Patrick's eyes flicked toward Miss Marple, who was watching him closely. I suppose Julia can. And before that, Patrick hesitated. I was in the library. Alone. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Did you see anyone else in the house? Patrick's mouth twitched. I might have seen Mitzi in the kitchen. Miss Marple's eyes lit up. Mitzi? Yes, the maid. She's rather excitable, Patrick said, his smile thin. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Excitable, yes, but observant. At that moment, Julia entered the room, her expression taut. What's going on? Just answering a few questions, Patrick said smoothly. Julia's eyes narrowed. Patrick's already told you. We were in the garden. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Julia's face. It's so fortunate, isn't it? She said softly. What is? Julia asked. That you were together, Miss Marple replied. Otherwise, there might have been misunderstandings. Julia's lips parted slightly, but before she could respond, the door opened. Mitzi burst in, wringing her hands. "It's gone," she cried. "What's gone?" Craddock demanded. "The key to the side door," Mitzi said breathlessly. "It was hanging in the kitchen this morning, but now it's gone." Miss Marple's smile deepened. "Ah, it seems our killer is becoming careless." Miss Marple sat in the garden at Little Paddocks, a basket of knitting on her lap, but her mind was far from domestic matters. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align, but the picture was not yet complete. Chief Inspector Craddock joined her, his brow furrowed. "The key is still missing," he said. "And no one saw anything?" "Mitzi swears she left it on its hook in the kitchen," Craddock replied. "And yet," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "it disappeared shortly after Bunny's death." Craddock frowned. "You think the two are connected?" "I think everything is connected," Miss Marple replied. "The announcement in the paper, Rudy Schertz's death, Bunny's poisoning, even the missing key." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You suspect a pattern?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I suspect a person." Craddock leaned closer. "And who might that be?" "Not yet, Inspector," Miss Marple said softly. "But I believe I know why this is happening." Craddock's gaze sharpened. "Why?" Miss Marple's eyes grew distant. "Because someone is trying to rewrite the past." Craddock's brow furrowed. "The past?" "Letitia Blacklock's past," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps someone else's." A shadow fell across the grass. Julia stood nearby, arms crossed. "Am I interrupting?" Miss Marple's smile didn't waver. "Not at all, my dear." Julia's gaze was cool. "You seem very interested in Letitia's past." "Shouldn't I be?" Miss Marple asked. "After all, the motive for murder is so often buried in the past." Julia's expression tightened. "Letitia has nothing to hide." "Does she?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Julia's eyes darkened. "What are you implying?" "That perhaps Letitia Blacklock is not quite who she claims to be." Julia's mouth opened slightly, but before she could speak, Mitzi's voice shrilled through the air. "Miss Blacklock! Miss Blacklock!" Miss Marple and Craddock turned toward the house. Mitzi stood on the terrace, her face pale. "Miss Blacklock has collapsed." Miss Marple rose swiftly. "Come, Inspector. I fear we may be running out of time." Miss Marple and Chief Inspector Craddock hurried into the drawing room at Little Paddocks. Letitia Blacklock lay on the floor, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Mitzi stood nearby, wringing her hands. "I found her like this," she cried. "I was bringing her tea." Miss Marple knelt beside Letitia, her gloved hand gently touching her wrist. "She's breathing, but weakly." "Poison?" Craddock asked sharply. "Possibly," Miss Marple replied. "We need a doctor." Craddock turned toward Mitzi. "Who else has been in this room?" Mitzi shook her head frantically. "No one. I swear, I was in the kitchen preparing tea." Miss Marple's gaze settled on the teacup, resting on a nearby table. "Did you pour this tea, Mitzi?" Mitzi's eyes widened. "Yes, I brought it straight from the kitchen." Miss Marple's eyes darkened. "And where did the tea leaves come from?" "From the tin in the pantry," Mitzi replied breathlessly. Miss Marple lifted the cup and sniffed. Her mouth tightened. "Bitter almonds." Craddock's expression hardened. "Cyanide." Miss Marple nodded. "Someone wanted Miss Blacklock dead, and they almost succeeded." Letitia stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "What happened?" "You were poisoned," Craddock said bluntly. "Can you remember anything unusual?" Letitia's brow creased. "No. Mitzi brought the tea. I took one sip, and then—" Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Did you notice anyone else near the pantry earlier today?" Letitia's eyes darkened. I can't remember." Patrick and Julia entered the room. "What's happened?" Patrick demanded. "Someone tried to kill Miss Blacklock," Craddock replied grimly. Patrick's eyes widened. "But who would do such a thing?" Julia's gaze swept toward the teacup. And why? Miss Marple rose to her feet. Because Miss Blacklock knows something. Something dangerous. Letitia sat up slowly, her hand pressed to her chest. I don't know what you mean. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Perhaps not, but I suspect that someone else knows exactly what you mean. Craddock's gaze hardened. And that person is in this house. Miss Marple's eyes settled briefly on Patrick and Julia. Yes, Inspector. And I think it's time we force them to reveal themselves. Miss Marple sat calmly in the drawing room at Little Paddock's. Letitia Blacklock had been taken to bed to recover, but the shadow of danger still lingered in the air. Chief Inspector Craddock stood nearby, his arms crossed as he studied the faces of the gathered household. Patrick and Julia sat side by side on the sofa. Mitzi hovered nervously near the door. Philippa Hames stood by the fireplace, her hands clasped tightly together. Craddock's gaze swept over them. Someone in this room poisoned Miss Blacklock. Julia scoffed. And why would anyone want to harm Letitia? Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Because Letitia Blacklock may not be who she claims to be. Patrick's expression darkened. What exactly are you suggesting? That the inheritance Letitia Blacklock stands to gain is at the heart of this mystery, Miss Marple said softly. Randall Goldler's fortune was left to his widow, Belle. After Belle's death, it would pass to Letitia unless, of course, Letitia wasn't alive to claim it. Philippa's eyes widened. But why would anyone want to stop Letitia from inheriting? Miss Marple's gaze settled on Patrick and Julia. Because if Letitia Blacklock died, the fortune would pass to the next of kin. And the next of kin is... Patrick's mouth tightened. Julia and I, he said. But you can't possibly think we'd. Miss Marple's smile was faint. You and Julia arrived here quite suddenly, didn't you? After years of no contact with Letitia. Julia's face hardened. You think we tried to kill her? I think you had the opportunity, Miss Marple replied. But no, I don't believe you were the mastermind. Patrick's brow furrowed. Then who? Miss Marple's gaze swept toward Mitzi. Mitzi, my dear, what exactly did you see on the night of the shooting? Mitzi's eyes widened. I was in the kitchen. I heard the shot. I hid under the table. And before that, Miss Marple pressed gently. Mitzi's mouth trembled. I saw someone near the side door, someone wearing dark clothes. Miss Marple nodded. A figure in the shadows. But Mitzi, could you see their face? Mitzi shook her head. No, but they moved quickly like they knew the house. Exactly, Miss Marple said softly. Someone who belongs here. Someone close enough to Letitia to know her routines and habits. Philippa's face paled. You're saying the killer is one of us? Miss Marple's smile thinned. I believe we've known the killer's identity all along. We just haven't seen them clearly yet. Craddock's gaze sharpened. And what do you suggest we do? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. We lay a trap. Miss Marple sat by the fireplace that evening, her knitting needles clicking softly. The air in Little Paddock's was thick with tension. Chief Inspector Craddock stood near the window, watching the garden as the last light of day faded into dusk. Letitia Blacklock, still pale from her recent poisoning, sat stiffly in an armchair. Patrick, Julia, Philippa, and Mitzi were gathered in the room as well, each wearing expressions of quiet unease. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Letitia. You're feeling better, I hope? Yes, Letitia said faintly. But I can't stop wondering why. Why would someone want to kill me? Because, Miss Marple said softly, you're not who they expected you to be. Julia scoffed. Oh, not this again. Miss Marple's smile didn't waver. Randall Goldler's fortune was intended to pass to his widow, Belle. After Belle's death, it would pass to Letitia unless Letitia was no longer alive. Patrick's eyes narrowed. We know that already. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. But here's the complication. Randall Goldler had a sister named Charlotte. Charlotte suffered from health issues. She was quiet, reclusive, and withdrawn. She eventually went abroad for treatment and never returned. Philippa's brow furrowed. But what does that have to do with Letitia? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. What if Charlotte didn't die? Letitia's hands tightened on the armrests. What are you suggesting? That the real Letitia Blacklock died years ago, Miss Marple said calmly, and Charlotte took her place. Julia's mouth opened. That's impossible. Miss Marple's eyes didn't leave Letitia's pale face. Is it? Craddock stepped forward. You're saying that the woman sitting in this room is actually Charlotte? Letitia's face remained still. You have no proof. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Perhaps not, but the killer knows the truth. The killer knew the real Letitia was dead. And when Charlotte stood to inherit the Godler fortune, the killer knew they had to act. Patrick's face darkened. But why would anyone care? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Because someone else stands to inherit if Letitia, or rather, Charlotte, dies. Craddock's eyes narrowed. And you think the killer will try again? I'm counting on it, Miss Marple said softly. That's why tonight we'll be watching. Letitia's gaze hardened. You're using me as bait. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Not bait, my dear. Just opportunity. A chill settled over the room. Julia's gaze flicked toward Patrick. Patrick's eyes darkened. Philippa's hands twisted together. Mitzi glanced nervously toward the door. And when the killer strikes, Miss Marple said calmly, we'll be ready. Night had settled over Little Paddocks. A chill mist clung to the ground, curling around the darkened hedges and creeping up the stone walls of the house. Inside, the atmosphere is tense. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing room, knitting resting on her lap. Chief Inspector Craddock stood by the window, watching the shadows beyond the glass. Letitia Blacklock was seated nearby, her face pale but composed. The rest of the household had retreated to their rooms, except for Mitzi, who was in the kitchen preparing a late-night tray of tea. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the clock on the mantelpiece. It's nearly midnight. Craddock's mouth tightened. If the killer intends to strike, it will be soon. Letitia's hands tightened on the armrests. And what if they don't? They will, Miss Marple said softly. They have no choice now. A creaking sound echoed from the hallway. Craddock's head snapped toward the door. Footsteps, soft and measured. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. It's time. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Letitia gasped. What's happening? Stay still, Craddock ordered. Miss Marple rose slowly, her sharp eyes adjusting to the dimness. A shadow moved in the hallway, a dark figure slipping toward the drawing room. Craddock's hand went to his revolver. Show yourself. A figure stepped into the room. The glow of the moonlight through the window illuminated a thin face and dark eyes. Julia. Julia, Craddock said sharply. Julia's expression was tight. I heard something. What did you hear? Craddock demanded. Before Julia could answer, another shadow slipped through the doorway. Patrick. His eyes gleamed in the half-light. What's going on? We were hoping you could tell us, Miss Marple said calmly. Patrick's gaze swept toward Letitia. What's happening? Suddenly, a metallic clink sounded from a hallway. Footsteps, fast and sharp. Craddock raised his revolver. Stop. A figure darted toward Letitia. A flash of steel caught the moonlight. A knife. No. Miss Marple shouted as Craddock lunged forward. The figure's hand shot out. Letitia screamed. Craddock tackled the figure to the floor. A struggle. The knife clattered onto the polished wood. Hold him. Craddock shouted. The figure twisted beneath him. A face appeared in the half-light. Philippa. Philippa? Julia's voice was stunned. Philippa's face was hard and cold. Let me go. Craddock pinned her arms. What the hell are you doing? Philippa's breath came fast and ragged. It's not what you think. Miss Marple's gaze narrowed. Oh, I think it's exactly what we think. Philippa's eyes burned. You don't understand. No, Miss Marple said softly. I understand perfectly. You were after the inheritance, weren't you? You knew Letitia wasn't the real heir. If Charlotte died, the fortune would pass to the next living relative. Patrick's face darkened. Philippa? Philippa's face twisted. You think it was easy? Watching someone else take what should have been ours. But why poison? Craddock demanded. It wasn't meant to be poison, Philippa said coldly. I was trying to frighten her. But then I realized it would be so much simpler if Letitia was out of the way. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, and the shooting, Philippa's mouth tightened. It was never meant to hit her, just enough to cause panic. But when it failed, Craddock's grip tightened on her arm. You were willing to kill your own family for money? Philippa's expression hardened. You don't know what it's like to have everything stolen from you. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. Actually, I do, but murder is never justified. Craddock pulled Philippa to her feet. You'll have plenty of time to reflect on that. Philippa's gaze darkened. You think you've won? You have no idea what you've uncovered. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Oh, my dear, I think we know exactly what we've uncovered. Philippa stood rigidly between two constables as Chief Inspector Craddock adjusted his coat. The tension in the drawing room was palpable. Letitia Blacklock sat motionless in the armchair, her face pale and tight. Julia and Patrick hovered near the fireplace, their expressions a mix of disbelief and horror. Miss Marple's knitting lay abandoned on the small side table. Her sharp eyes were focused on Philippa. Why? Julia's voice broke the silence. Why would you try to kill Letitia? Philippa's mouth curled. You wouldn't understand. Try us, Craddock said coldly. Philippa's gaze was dark. Randall Godler's fortune should have been ours. My mother was his niece. We should have been the rightful heirs. Patrick's eyes narrowed. But Letitia was named in the will. Because Randall trusted Letitia. Philippa's voice hardened. But Letitia was dead. Charlotte took her place. And nobody questioned it. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. So you knew all along? Philippa's eyes flicked toward Letitia. Yes, I suspected it for years. When Belle Godler died, I knew Charlotte would inherit everything. That's when I realized there was only one way to correct a mistake. Murder, Craddock said coldly. Philippa's face remained impassive. It wasn't personal. It was necessary. Julia's eyes widened. That's why you came here, isn't it? To position yourself close enough to strike. Philippa's gaze sharpened. Exactly. The announcement was my opportunity. A convenient little accident. If Charlotte died in the chaos, no one would question it. The inheritance would pass to the next legal heir. And that would be you, Miss Marple said calmly. Philippa's chin lifted. It was supposed to be easy. But then you started asking questions. Miss Marple's smile was faint. A little too clever for you, I suppose. Philippa's expression darkened. You have no idea how long I planned this. Oh, I imagine you've thought about it for years, Miss Marple replied. But greed has a way of clouding judgment. You underestimated how much people observe, how much they notice. Philippa's jaw tightened. So what now? You hand me over to the police? Craddock's mouth twitched. Yes, that's exactly what happens now. Philippa's smile faded. You think you've solved everything? You haven't. There's more to this story than you realize. I suppose we'll find out soon enough, Craddock said. Take her away. The constables led Philippa toward the door. As they passed Miss Marple, Philippa's gaze locked onto her. You think you're clever, don't you? Philippa hissed. But you missed something. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Did I? Philippa's eyes glittered dangerously. Letitia isn't the only one with secrets. Philippa's gaze drifted toward Julia, lingering there for a moment too long. Then the door closed behind her. Silence stretched in the room. Julia's face had gone pale. Patrick's hand settled on her shoulder. It's over now, he said softly. No, Miss Marple said quietly. It's not over yet. Julia's eyes widened. What do you mean? Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the closed door. Philippa was right about one thing. Letitia isn't the only one with secrets. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the night stretched dark and endless. Miss Marple's eyes were sharp as glass. We still have unfinished business. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the dark paneled walls of the drawing room. Letitia Blacklock sat stiffly in her chair, her pale hands folded in her lap. Julia and Patrick sat nearby, the tension between them palpable. Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten on the side table. Her gaze was fixed thoughtfully on the window, where moonlight filtered through thin lace curtains. What did she mean? Julia's voice was thin. Philippa said Letitia wasn't the only one with secrets. Miss Marple's expression remained calm. I think you know exactly what she meant, dear. Julia's face went rigid. I don't understand. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. No? Perhaps I should explain then. Julia's hands tightened on the armrest of the chair. I've done nothing wrong. Perhaps not, Miss Marple said softly. But you haven't been entirely honest, have you? Patrick's gaze darkened. Miss Marple, what are you suggesting? Miss Marple's gaze settled on Julia. When Philippa referred to Letitia's inheritance, she said that if Letitia had died, the fortune would have passed to the next living relative. But the legal heir would not have been Philippa. It would have been Julia. Julia's face went pale. That's not true. Oh, but it is, Miss Marple replied. Randall Goldler's was very specific. If Letitia or Charlotte, as we now know, died, the inheritance would go to Randall's next closest blood relative. That would be you, Julia. Julia's lips parted in shock. But I didn't know. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Perhaps not at first, but I suspect you've known for a while. Patrick's eyes widened. Julia? Julia's hands trembled. I wouldn't. But Philippa would, Miss Marple said, and she knew you were standing in her way. That's why she tried to eliminate Letitia, because once Letitia was gone, you inherit, and Philippa could have influenced you. Julia's eyes darkened. She tried to kill me, too. Yes, Miss Marple said, because she realized you were beginning to suspect the truth. You saw her that night, didn't you? On the night of the announcement. Julia's face twisted. I saw her in the hallway. I thought she was going to bed, but then I heard a noise. Glass breaking. When I looked again, she was gone. Patrick's voice sharpened. Why didn't you say anything? Julia's gaze flashed toward him. Because I wasn't sure. I thought I might be wrong. Miss Marple's expression was kind but piercing. You knew you weren't wrong, Julia, but you were afraid to admit it. Because if Philippa was capable of murder, it meant that you might be next. Julia's breath hitched. I didn't know what to do. Patrick's face softened. You should have told me. It wouldn't have changed anything, Julia whispered. Philippa was determined. If it wasn't Letitia, it would have been me. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. That's why you stayed close to Letitia, isn't it? You knew that as long as Letitia was alive, Philippa would be focused on her. You thought it would give you time to figure out what to do. Julia's chin trembled. I thought I could stop her. Patrick's hand settled over hers. You're safe now. It's over. Miss Marple's eyes glinted in the firelight. Perhaps. But there's still one more question that needs answering. Julia's gaze lifted uncertainly. What question? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Who sent the announcement to the newspaper? Patrick's eyes narrowed. Philippa? Miss Marple shook her head slowly. No, it wasn't Philippa. Julia's eyes widened. Then who? Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Letitia. I think you know. Letitia's hands tightened on the armrests. I didn't. Miss Marple's gaze softened. You didn't send it yourself, but someone close to you did. Someone who wanted to flush out the truth. Julia's eyes widened. Charlotte. Miss Marple nodded. Charlotte knew someone was after her. She knew that Philippa had discovered the truth about her identity, so she orchestrated the announcement as a trap. Patrick's mouth tightened. But why not tell the police? Because Charlotte didn't know who she could trust, Miss Marple replied. She knew Philippa would try to take the inheritance by force. But what she didn't realize, Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, was how far Philippa was willing to go. Letitia's voice was thin. She knew. Miss Marple's smile was gentle. Charlotte was cleverer than most people realized. She played the long game. But in the end, she trusted that justice would find its way to the surface. Julia's breath hitched. But she died anyway. Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Yes, and now, Philippa will have an answer for it. The atmosphere in the drawing room was brittle, charged with unspoken truths and hidden fears. The crackle of the fire was the only sound as Miss Marple's gaze settled on Letitia Blacklock. Letitia's face was pale, her hands trembling slightly against the armrests. Julia and Patrick watched her closely, their expressions taut with uncertainty. Chief Inspector Craddock stood near the window, his arms crossed. "Miss Blacklock," Miss Marple said softly, "there's something you need to tell us." Letitia's gaze darted nervously toward the inspector. I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple's eyes remained sharp. Philippa said that Letitia wasn't the only one with secrets. I think she was right. Letitia's chin lifted slightly. "I've already told you everything I know." "Not quite." Miss Marple's tone was gentle but firm. "You've been hiding something from the very beginning." Patrick frowned. "What are you suggesting?" Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Letitia Blacklock died years ago. The woman sitting before us is Charlotte." Julia's mouth opened in shock. "But we already know that." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "But what we haven't considered is why Charlotte took Letitia's place in the first place." Letitia, Charlotte's face tightened. "You don't understand." "Oh, but I think I do." Miss Marple's voice was calm. "You and Letitia were twins. Identical. When Letitia became ill, you switched places to protect the inheritance. But Letitia's death left you with a problem." "Randall's will," Craddock said darkly. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. If it became known that Letitia had died, the inheritance would have passed to Julia. But you needed that money to survive." Charlotte's lips parted, her eyes wide with fear. "I never intended for anyone to get hurt. But you knew that once Belle Godler died, the truth would come out," Miss Marple continued. "So you arranged for the announcement, a clever little trap, to force the truth into the open while you still control the narrative. But then Rudy's shirt showed up," Craddock said, "and everything changed." Charlotte's hands clenched tightly. "I never meant for him to die." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "No, but once the first crime was committed, the rest became inevitable." Patrick's voice was tight. "But why not tell the truth once Philippa became a threat?" Charlotte's gaze darkened. "Because Philippa would have killed me if I had. I knew what she was after. She wasn't interested in justice. She wanted the money." Julia's voice trembled. "And you were willing to let her kill you for it?" Charlotte's gaze softened as it settled on Julia. "I was willing to protect you. You're my blood. Randall's legacy was meant for you." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "But you lied to me." "I lied to protect you." Charlotte's voice was thin. "And I would do it again." Miss Marple's gaze was soft but steady. "But you didn't expect Philippa to act so ruthlessly, did you?" Charlotte's eyes darkened. "No, I underestimated her." Craddock's mouth tightened. "And that miscalculation nearly cost you your life." Charlotte's gaze lowered. "I know." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "But the truth is out now. Philippa will answer for her crimes. The inheritance will pass to Julia." Julia's eyes widened. "But what happens to Charlotte?" Craddock's expression was dark. "That's a legal matter. Fraud. False identity. It will have to be dealt with." Julia's voice rose. "But she saved me." Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Yes, she did. And I suspect the court will take that into consideration." Charlotte's gaze darkened. "I never wanted the money. I just want to keep the family safe." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Sometimes the greatest act of love requires sacrifice." Julia's voice broke. "She shouldn't have to go to prison." Craddock's gaze was hard. "The law doesn't always see it that way." Charlotte's gaze lingered on Julia. "I'm not afraid of consequences." Julia's hands trembled. "But I am." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Perhaps it's time for the truth to bring healing instead of harm." Charlotte's gaze darkened. "It's too late for that." Miss Marple's smile was faint. "It's never too late." The room remained still, the weight of Charlotte's confession pressing heavily upon them all. Julia's tear-streaked face was pale as she sat beside Charlotte. Patrick's hand rested on her shoulder, his gaze dark and conflicted. Chief Inspector Craddock's jaw was tight as he regarded Charlotte with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. You've admitted to fraud, impersonation, and the cover-up of a crime. That's enough to put you away for a very long time. Charlotte's chin lifted slightly. I understand. Julia's voice was strained. You can't take her away. She was protecting us. Protecting you? Craddock's eyes narrowed. By allowing an innocent man to die. Charlotte's face crumpled. I never meant for Rudy to die. I thought he was only trying to blackmail me. I didn't realize he was being manipulated. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Manipulated? By whom? Charlotte's eyes closed. Philippa. She knew the truth about my identity. She also knew about Randall's inheritance. Rudy was working for her. Julia's face paled. Philippa knew? Charlotte nodded slowly. She must have pressured Rudy to confront me. When he demanded money, I thought he was acting alone. I was wrong. Craddock's mouth tightened. But Philippa's plan failed. Why kill Rudy? Charlotte's eyes darkened. Because he got cold feet. He threatened to expose her. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. So Philippa killed him to cover her tracks. Yes. Charlotte's voice was soft. She knew that as long as I was Letitia Blacklock, she could manipulate me. But if the truth came out, she would lose everything. Julia's eyes filled with tears. She was going to kill you, wasn't she? Charlotte's gaze darkened. Yes. The shooting at the announcement, she arranged it. Patrick's jaw clenched. But why? What did she stand to gain? Control. Miss Marple's tone was quiet. With Charlotte dead, the inheritance would have passed to Julia, and Philippa would have had access to it through manipulation or marriage. Julia's face contorted in horror. She planned everything? Charlotte's gaze was hollow. From the beginning, Craddock's voice was sharp. And you let her stay close to Julia? I thought I could control her, Charlotte whispered. I was wrong. Miss Marple's eyes were sharp. Philippa never wanted justice. She wanted wealth and power. And she almost got away with it, Craddock added grimly. Except Miss Marple was watching. Miss Marple's faint smile didn't reach her eyes. Human nature rarely changes. Greed and desperation make for predictable patterns. Julia's voice trembled. But now what happens? Charlotte's gaze softened as she reached for Julia's hand. You'll be safe now. That's all that matters. Craddock's mouth tightened. And you'll face the consequences. Charlotte's gaze was steady. Yes. Julia's grip on her hand tightened. But you saved me. Charlotte's smile was faint. That's what family does. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Perhaps mercy might be the answer this time. Craddock's eyes narrowed. That's not my decision to make. Miss Marple's smile deepened. No, but perhaps the court will understand the difference between malice and survival. Charlotte's gaze lowered. I'm prepared to face whatever comes next. Julia's eyes shone with unshed tears. You shouldn't have to. Charlotte's voice was quiet. It's already done. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Charlotte for a moment before she rose from her seat. And perhaps it's not too late to set things right. The heavy silence in the drawing room was broken by the sound of the door creaking open. Philippa Hames stood in the doorway, her expression composed but her eyes dark with calculation. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Ah, Philippa, just in time. Philippa's lips curled into a thin smile. Am I interrupting? Craddock's gaze darkened. Hardly. Philippa's eyes flicked towards Charlotte and Julia. You've been talking, haven't you? Miss Marple's smile didn't reach her eyes. Yes, and it seems your carefully crafted plan is unraveling. Philippa's gaze narrowed. I don't know what you mean. Miss Marple's expression remained calm. Don't you? Philippa's gaze darkened. You're making a mistake. I don't think so, Miss Marple replied smoothly. Rudy Schertz's death was no accident, and you knew exactly what would happen when you orchestrated the shooting. Philippa's smile turned cold. You have no proof. Craddock's voice was sharp. No. Rudy's last message, written on that scrap of paper, contained your name. Philippa's eyes flickered with the faintest hint of alarm. It proves nothing. Perhaps not legally, Miss Marple said softly. But it's enough to reveal your motive. Philippa's gaze remained hard. And what exactly was my motive? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Greed. Philippa's expression didn't change. You think I killed Rudy for money? No, Miss Marple replied. You killed him because he was a liability. He knew too much. Philippa's smile sharpened. Even if that were true, you can't prove I pulled the trigger. Miss Marple's expression remained serene. Perhaps not, but we don't need to. Philippa's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Craddock's mouth twisted into a thin smile. The gun was traced back to a contact of yours in London, a known associate. Rudy's fingerprints were on the handle, but so were yours. Philippa's face tightened. That's impossible. Craddock's smile deepened. We matched the prints this morning. Philippa's eyes darkened. It won't hold in court. Miss Marple's smile remained calm. It won't have to. Once the truth is known, the weight of evidence will speak for itself. Philippa's expression hardened. You think you've won. Justice isn't about winning or losing, Miss Marple replied softly. It's about truth. Philippa's gaze flashed toward Julia. You think you're safe now? That money is still mine. Julia's expression darkened. It was never yours to begin with. Philippa's smile turned dangerous. You think I'll let it go that easily? Patrick's voice was sharp. I think you don't have a choice. Philippa's gaze narrowed. And why is that? Miss Marple's smile deepened. Because there's already a warrant for your arrest. Philippa's face paled. You! The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. 2 uniformed officers appeared in the doorway. Craddock's gaze was cold. Philippa Hames, you're under arrest for the murder of Rudy's shirts and conspiracy to commit fraud. Philippa's expression twisted into something dark and bitter. This isn't over. Miss Marple's gaze was calm. Oh, I rather think it is. The officers moved forward, seizing Philippa by the arms. She didn't resist, but her gaze remained locked on Julia. You'll regret this, she hissed. All of you. Julia's voice was low and steady. No, Philippa. The only one with regrets will be you. Philippa's gaze darkened. We'll see. The officers led Philippa away. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor as the sound faded down the hallway. Julia's breath shuddered as the door closed behind them. It's over. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Yes, at last. Patrick's hand settled on Julia's shoulder. You're safe now. Julia's gaze remained troubled. But at what cost? Miss Marple's voice was gentle. The truth always comes at a cost. But in the end, it's the only thing that sets us free. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the polished wooden floor. Julia sat by the window, her gaze lost in the garden beyond. The events of the past days lingered like shadows in the air, heavy but beginning to fade. Patrick sat nearby, his hands resting on his knees. His gaze was steady, his presence comforting. You haven't spoken much since yesterday. Julia's gaze remained fixed on the window. It's hard to believe it's over. Patrick's voice was gentle. It is over. Philippa's been charged. Charlotte told the truth. There's nothing left to uncover. Julia's eyes were troubled. But everything's changed. Charlotte, she's not really my aunt. Patrick's hand covered hers. That doesn't make what she did any less meaningful. Julia's eyes filled with tears. She risked everything to protect me, and now she's going to pay for it. Patrick's gaze was steady. Maybe not. Julia's eyes widened. What do you mean? The sound of soft footsteps interrupted them. Miss Marple stood in the doorway, her knitting in hand and a warm smile on her face. Charlotte's story is more complicated than it seems. Julia's gaze sharpened, but she confessed. Miss Marple's smile deepened. Yes, but the court will consider the circumstances. Charlotte acted to protect you and to stop Philippa from gaining control of the inheritance. The law may be harsh, but sometimes mercy prevails. Julia's hands twisted in her lap. Do you think she'll be forgiven? Miss Marple's gaze softened. Forgiven? Perhaps. But the burden of truth is not so easily lifted. Patrick's brow furrowed. And what about Philippa? Miss Marple's smile faded. Philippa's motives were rooted in greed and manipulation. The court will show her no mercy. Julia's voice was soft. And Charlotte acted out of love, Miss Marple said gently. That makes all the difference. Julia's gaze darkened. But she lied to me for years. How am I supposed to trust her now? Miss Marple's gaze was knowing. Trust isn't built on perfection. It's built on truth. And Charlotte told you the truth when it mattered most. Julia's breath trembled. But what happens now? Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. That's up to you. Julia's lips parted, but she hesitated. I'm not sure I know how to forgive her. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Then perhaps you should start by understanding her. Julia's eyes filled with uncertainty. What if I can't? Miss Marple's gaze was warm. Then you'll have to decide whether you want to carry the weight of resentment or the gift of compassion. Julia's gaze lowered. It's not that simple. Miss Marple's smile deepened. No, but the best things rarely are. Patrick's hand squeezed Julia's gently. You don't have to figure it all out today. Julia's lips pressed together. But I have to start somewhere. Miss Marple's voice was soft. Then perhaps you might start by speaking to Charlotte. Julia's breath caught. Do you think she wants to see me? Without question. Julia's gaze lifted toward the hallway. A shadow moved across the doorway. Charlotte stood there, her hands clasped, her expression cautious but hopeful. Julia. Charlotte's voice was soft. Julia's breath trembled. Charlotte, Charlotte's gaze was steady. I never expected you to forgive me, but I need you to know I never stopped loving you. Julia's lips trembled, and I never stopped needing you. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. Then perhaps we can start again. Julia's breath shuddered. Yes. Charlotte crossed the room and hesitated. Julia stood and took her hand. Their fingers intertwined. A quiet understanding passed between them. Miss Marple's smile was faint as she turned toward Patrick. It seemed some things are worth saving, after all. Patrick's gaze softened. Yes, they are. The light from the window brightened, casting warmth across the room as Julia and Charlotte stood together, hand in hand. The morning sun broke through the gray clouds, casting light across the village green. The atmosphere at Little Paddocks was quiet, almost too quiet. The events of the past few days had left their mark on the household and the village alike. But now, there was a sense of fragile peace settling over the house. Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair by the fireplace, her knitting resting on her lap. Chief Inspector Craddock stood nearby, his hands clasped behind his back. Philippa has been formally charged, Craddock said quietly. The evidence against her is overwhelming. Miss Marple's gaze remained calm. And Charlotte? Craddock's expression softened. Charlotte's case will be handled carefully. Her actions were motivated by protection, not malice. The court will take that into account. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. I expect the judge will show mercy. Craddock's gaze darkened slightly. Perhaps, but Philippa, there will be no mercy for her. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Philippa knew exactly what she was doing. The plan to kill Rudy's shirts was calculated. The only thing she misjudged was human nature. Craddock's brow furrowed. Human nature? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Greed always leads to carelessness. And Philippa was very greedy. Craddock sighed. And now she'll pay the price. Miss Marple's gaze remained thoughtful. Justice comes in many forms, Inspector. Craddock's gaze sharpened. You sound as though you pity her. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Pity? No, but I understand her. A life driven by greed is a life without peace. Even without a prison cell, Philippa would never have found freedom. Craddock's gaze darkened. You think that's punishment enough? No, Miss Marple said softly. But it's a consequence she'll have to live with. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Julia stood in the doorway, her expression composed but tinged with uncertainty. Am I interrupting? Miss Marple's smile deepened. Not at all, my dear. Julia's gaze flicked toward Craddock. I heard about Philippa. Craddock nodded. It's over now. Julia's hands twisted together. And Charlotte, she'll face questioning, Craddock said carefully. But the court will be lenient. Her motives were clear. Julia's gaze lowered. She only wanted to protect me. Miss Marple's voice was soft. Yes, and that's what the court will understand. Julia's breath trembled. And Philippa? Craddock's gaze darkened. Philippa will face the full weight of the law. Julia's lips pressed together. I thought I knew her. Miss Marple's expression was kind. We never truly know the depths of another person's heart until they are tested. Julia's eyes filled with quiet sorrow. I still don't understand why she hated me so much. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Because you had something she never did. Julia's brow furrowed. What? Love, Miss Marple said simply. Philippa was consumed by bitterness. She saw your happiness as a reminder of her own emptiness. Julia's breath trembled. That's no excuse. No, Miss Marple agreed. But it explains why she did what she did. Julia's gaze darkened. Do you think I'll ever understand it? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Perhaps. In time. Julia's voice was soft. And what about Charlotte? She'll need you, Miss Marple said gently. And you'll need her. Julia's gaze lifted toward Craddock. What happens now? Craddock's expression softened. Now you rebuild. Julia's eyes darkened. And how do I do that? Miss Marple's voice was calm. By starting with the truth. Julia's breath trembled. And if I don't know what the truth is anymore? Miss Marple's smile deepened. Then you'll have to discover it. Julia's gaze sharpened. And where do I start? Miss Marple's eyes glinted. With forgiveness. Julia's lips pressed together. And if I can't forgive her? Then you'll have to live with the weight of that choice, Miss Marple said softly. But forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about setting yourself free. Julia's gaze softened. Free from what? From bitterness, Miss Marple replied. From the ghosts of the past. Julia's gaze remained troubled. And if I fail? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Then you try again. Julia's breath shuddered. And if I succeed? Miss Marple's gaze warmed. Then you'll find peace. Craddock's gaze sharpened. And Philippa? Miss Marple's expression darkened. Philippa will have to find peace in her own way. But some roads lead only to darkness. Julia's gaze darkened. And if she never finds it? Miss Marple's voice was soft. Then that will be her burden to bear. Julia's breath trembled. And mine. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. Yours is to live. Julia's breath steadied. I'll try. Miss Marple's smile deepened. That's all any of us can do. The light from the window brightened as Julia's gaze softened. The room settled into a quiet peace, the storm of the past days beginning to fade into memory. A week had passed since the events at Little Paddocks. The village had slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, though the undercurrent of the recent tragedy still lingered beneath the surface. At the village church, the bell tolled softly, signaling the hour. Miss Marple sat on a weathered wooden pew near the back of the church, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The service was simple but dignified. Flowers adorned the altar, white lilies and roses. Julia sat near the front, her head bowed. Charlotte sat beside her, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched Julia's hand. Miss Marple's gaze softened as she observed them. Grief had left its mark on both women, but so had resilience. After the service, the congregation gathered quietly in the churchyard. Chief Inspector Craddock stood near the gate, his gaze steady as Miss Marple approached. It was a beautiful service, Miss Marple said softly. Craddock's expression was grave. A pity it had to happen at all. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Sometimes it takes tragedy to reveal the truth. Craddock's gaze darkened. Philippa's trial is scheduled for next month. She's refusing to speak to anyone. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. Guilt is a heavy burden. Craddock's brow furrowed. Do you think she regrets it? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Perhaps not yet, but the weight of her choices will settle eventually. Craddock's gaze sharpened. And Charlotte? Miss Marple's gaze softened. She's free now, but freedom comes with its own price. Craddock's gaze darkened. You think she'll recover? Miss Marple's smile deepened. She is Julia. That will make all the difference. Julia approached quietly, her expression composed but tinged with quiet sorrow. Miss Marple? Miss Marple's gaze warmed. My dear! Julia's hands twisted together. I still don't understand why Philippa hated me so much. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Because you were loved. Julia's brow furrowed. And that was enough to make her kill? For some, Miss Marple said softly, the sight of another person's happiness becomes an unbearable reminder of their own emptiness. Julia's gaze darkened. It still doesn't make sense. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Human nature rarely does. Julia's breath trembled. Do you think I'll ever forgive her? Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. Forgiveness isn't about excusing the crime. It's about setting yourself free. Julia's lips pressed together. And if I can't? Miss Marple's gaze softened. Then you'll carry the weight of it. Julia's gaze darkened. I don't know if I'm strong enough. Miss Marple's smile deepened. You are. Charlotte approached quietly, her expression calm but watchful. Julia? Julia's gaze softened. I'm here. Charlotte's gaze flicked toward Miss Marple. Thank you. Miss Marple's smile was faint. There's no need to thank me, my dear. You saved yourself. Charlotte's gaze darkened. I still don't understand why Philippa hated me so much. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Because you were loved. That's the most dangerous thing of all. Charlotte's breath trembled. What happens now? Miss Marple's gaze softened. Now you live. Charlotte's gaze darkened. And Philippa? Miss Marple's smile faded. Philippa's path is no longer your burden to carry. Charlotte's gaze remained troubled. But how do we move forward? Miss Marple's smile deepened. By choosing to. Craddock's gaze sharpened. And if they fail? Miss Marple's gaze was steady. Then they try again. Julia's breath steadied. I'll try. Charlotte's hand tightened around Julia's. So will I? Miss Marple's gaze warmed. That's all any of us can do. Julia's gaze softened as Charlotte's hand rested on hers. The church bells tolled softly in the distance. Craddock's gaze sharpened. And if Philippa never repents? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Then that will be her burden to bear. Julia's breath trembled. And mine! Miss Marple's gaze softened. Yours is to live. The afternoon light glinted off the stained glass windows as the sound of the bells faded. Miss Marple's gaze softened as Julia and Charlotte walked away, hand in hand. Craddock stood at her side, his gaze dark. Do you think they'll be all right? Craddock asked quietly. Miss Marple's gaze warmed. They have each other. That's more than enough. Craddock's gaze darkened. And Philippa? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Philippa's road leads elsewhere. Craddock's gaze remained troubled. And if she finds her way back? Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Some paths are closed forever. Craddock's breath steadied. And if they're not? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Then we prepare for what comes next. Justice had been served. The truth had been revealed. And yet, some wounds take longer to heal. But in the quiet village of Chipping Cleghorn, life would go on. And Miss Marple would always be watching, ready for the next mystery. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery with Miss Marple, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the Crit Stories, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another thrilling story. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done if you saw that chilling newspaper announcement?